伝説の武器が一つになりたいと叫んでいる。ハウリングキャノンだ。おう。もうないか。
ゲラーロ食べるだがトリケランス
流撃剣。ハウリングキャノン。
Today we're going to talk about the life and philosophy of Martin Heidegger. Martin Heidegger, if you guys don't already know, he was a 20th century philosopher dealing with language and philosophy. Language and ontology. And if you guys do not know what ontology means, ontology is essentially the inquiry into entities. What is the nature of X? Like, for example, you think of Christian ontology, what Christian philosophers are looking for in Christian ontology is what is the nature of the spirit, right? The soul. So ontology deals with like the nature of, the soul, entities, so on and so forth. So yeah, we're going to talk about Heidegger. And with me, I have always Mark. How's it going, Mark?
I'm good. Thank you for having me on.
Always, always. So Heidegger, what do you know about Heidegger?
So he actually began more in phenomenology, which is like like it was originally by Franz Brentano, and then became continued on by Husserl, who is seen as the main founder of it, and Heidegger was a student of Husserl, and basically there's a lot of different ways of describing phenomenology, but one of the ways is it's about actually seeing what the phenomena of experience is. So that's a way of doing philosophy where you might have one way of doing philosophy where you look at a table and you start asking, is this table like a physical table? Is it material, or is it in the mind, or something like that? Like, what is the outer existence of the table or something? But phenomenology would say, okay, how do I actually experience this table? Because it being like what its like ontological status is actually not something that immediately becomes obvious in phenomenological experience of it. Instead, you're saying, okay, do I feel near to this table? Can I put something on it? What are my intentions with this table? Like, do I see it as something that's part of the background of the house, or is it in the forefront for me right now? So those kinds of questions are the kinds of questions that are in phenomenology. And Heidegger basically begins with that, a lot of his philosophy with that. So, yeah.
So yeah, bouncing off of that, so Heidegger, dealing with phenomenology and ontology, he extends the notion of like, the phenomenological notion of like, what is an entity? How do I, not entity. What is this thing, this chair? How do I experience this chair? And he takes that and he applies it to history. And he has the scheme of a history that's similar to, I guess, typical understandings of Western history with ancient medieval modern. But instead of focusing on, like, I guess, a Marxist analysis, will focus on the social slash political slash economic conditions of history through this schema. Martin Heidegger focuses on the history of metaphysics, or as he would call it, ontotheology, like metaphysics as ontology, I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time saying the name or this word of ontology, the history of ontology in Western metaphysics. So he starts with the Greeks, obviously, and he makes a first stop at Plato, and he through his investigation of Plato's text, he starts to realize what we understood as Greek grammar, later reinterpretized to Latin grammar, is actually a misunderstanding. Particularly when Heidegger talks about Dasein in the Greek sense and how we understand it today, or in his time in the early 20th century, as Dasein being fixed, meaning that entities, they are, you think about classic Platonic dualism when you have a fixed entity, the single pure form, and where everything else emanates from. Heidegger is arguing against this, and he says, okay, well, that Platonic dualism that basically sculpted the history of Western ontology is a mystery, is a misunderstanding. What it really is, the verbiage of, or the infinitive verb of to be, meaning that existence itself is already imminent, is already experienced. And how we understand, existence is through our experience with it. And kind of like an after image, like a after effect of experiencing it, being in the world versus, this separation from the world, where the world is already conceived, there's already preset forms and, like, I guess, a theology about things. Um, but like I said, the reality, Heidegger argues, is actually the opposite. It's more dynamic, more fluid, more flux, in contrast to Plato. But yeah. So what would you add on to that, Mark?
Well, I would say that he's also not exactly criticizing Plato or putting himself like as the anti-Plato the way Nietzsche does. But part of what he's doing is he's actually trying to uncover how stuff in Plato isn't even as like dualistic as people later interpret it as. And actually there is a lot more like I guess pre-Socratic style philosophy in Plato. And for example, like with Nietzsche, he actually compares Nietzsche to Plato. And in many ways, he tries to show that with Nietzsche, by doing like an opposite inverse of Platonism, he's actually kind of copying Platonism, and he's still putting things within the same like structure and order. And because of that, uh, like one of Nietzsche's big things that he's attempting to do is to do what's called overcoming metaphysics. Uh,
Yeah,
means slightly different things for different people. So uh, I I guess this is also like another big topic. Originally, metaphysics is like the name of one of the books of Aristotle, and it was named that because there was Aristotle's physics, and then there was this extra stuff that was then called metaphysics, and means like beyond, and then physics back then meant like nature or like even sometimes meant being. So physis is sometimes another word for being, so it could even mean beyond being. But the way Nietzsche has like I would say less of a philosophical understanding of what metaphysics is and more of a social and like drive-based psychological understanding of metaphysics. So he thinks metaphysics is like a process where you devalue the immanent world and instead you create this world beyond the world, which you put all value towards. And that's like also something that Nietzsche sees as nihilistic. So he then sees like this kind of psychological interpretation of metaphysics as being nihilistic. And then Heidegger, he thinks metaphysics is basically the entire history of Western philosophy, that the entire history of Western philosophy, like metaphysics is a kind of ontology, according to Heidegger, because ontology is the study of being, and he contrasts it to what he's trying to do, which is fundamental ontology. So he's also trying to overcome metaphysics, but he's trying to overcome it by doing fundamental ontology. And the difference between just metaphysics, which is kind of regular ontology, and fundamental ontology is that even though they're both striving towards being, uh, which I guess that's another thing that I can't just quickly explain, but being is well, first of all, being isn't. Well, it's not. It's wrong to say being is, because there's this thing Heidegger has called the ontological gap, which is between beings and being, and he thinks beings are what are, and then being is it's not even correct to really say it's beyond beings. Basically, it's like, I don't know, there's not really any right set of words to.
Well, what I understand of Heidegger's metaphysics in relation to Nietzsche, um, and I said this to you before the podcast, I don't really see how, or I'll rephrase it. I see metaphysics through Heidegger as well as Nietzsche as a reaffirming of a particular like cultural viewpoint. You know, when I was doing the reading, like reading the literature, Heidegger stuff, and also like the connected stuff, like you read the word of Nietzsche or Nietzsche in the word, he's like bringing up like Hegel and Nietzsche and how like Hegel like preludes to Nietzsche or maybe Schopenhauer, because Schopenhauer comes after Hegel with this notion of nihilism. You read the faith and knowledge. Hegel's talking about like I start to see in European society a lack of faith in God. We all know with Schopenhauer, or if we don't know, I don't know if my audience is very familiar with Schopenhauer because he's not really a very popular philosopher nowadays. But Schopenhauer is really the first philosopher in Western, or at least Northwestern European history that pronounces the death of God. Like, the world isn't, the created through God, is actually just pure will. And Nietzsche comes about 50 years later with, his works. It pronounces completely the death of God. And from my understanding of, Heidegger, specifically the word, or Nietzsche in the word, Heidegger is saying that, these people, the philosophers that I just referenced, are taking a position within metaphysics, this cultural, metaphysical, like, field. They all share universally this common belief or notion that God is dying or he's dead, but they all have a different opinion on, how this process is unfolding. Like I said, Hegel believes that, there is a decline in faith, but, there's still a God, right? Schopenhauer doesn't believe in God at all, while Nietzsche is lamenting over the death of God, and he's trying to find a way to replace God with these transcendental values. So that's how I understand metaphysics in relation to Heidegger as well as Nietzsche, and generally, or in general. So, like, I was going to say one more thing. Oh yeah, that's also going to say. Going back to cultural metaphysics and whatnot, like if you study like the history, right? Like, German history from the 19th and 20th, um, a lot of the stuff that is said by these philosophers relate back to the actual time period. You read Will to Power, Nietzsche's criticizing society and culture. He's really talking about the Prussian government and like, the transitionary phase that was going on at the time, where Prussia was transitioning from, the Confederation of the Rhine, where you had all these member states, the fallout of the Napoleonic Wars and the Holy Roman Empire, they're competing for power. These two dominant states, being Prussia and Austria. Austria eventually loses out, and Prussia later becomes, Germany, and controls, the Rhine, or not the Rhine, but all the German territories. Nietzsche talks about this, and he says, the 19th century is essentially the century of power, pure power, and Brutus, brutal honesty. Because all it is just power. We're just, striving for power, political power, economic power, so on and so, military power. I think about Germany, like I said, Germany and Austria, they fought in 1866. Then you have the Franco-Prussian War, 1870, 1871. Then even Bismarck, the figure
And
himself.
Nietzsche actually participated in the Franco-Prussian War.
Oh, yeah, yeah, he did. He was a medic. Yeah, so like that too. He participated in the war. He saw firsthand the horrors of the war and the horrors of modernity, right? So I see or I understand, the Heideggerian philosophical position as twofold. One, historical and also two, cultural. Maybe three, linguistic, cultural, linguistic. And it's interesting because it's like you read all these people, like you read Heidegger, Nietzsche, Hegel, and it's like they're all saying the same thing, but they're like saying it in a different voice, you know. So yeah, that's how I see it. I see the metaphysics as cultural versus, well, this person right here has his own metaphysics as in, distinct contradiction or opposition to another individual, you know, within the same, culture, same nation, country, so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think that the way in which culture and metaphysics intertwine for Heidegger is basically like completely undisputed and uh, like unquestionably important. But he's also like I would say a philosophical supremacist, where he thinks that basically all of culture comes from philosophy, and that every aspect of life, like technology, uh, everything in modern life, basically comes from, like, for example, the Greek word techne, which later becomes what we know today as technology. He thinks that that was a certain way of unconcealing reality, and that kind of form of unconcealment, which stems from the like Western philosophical tradition, is what later, like, I guess, trickles down into all of Western culture. So that would be his way of uh, like saying which comes first of those two.
Well, like, yeah, he does talk a lot about, technology and philosophy and how important these two are. But he also talks about art, and what's that essay called? I forgot the name of that essay. It's a later
Origin,
essay he writes.
the work of art.
Yeah, the origin of the work of art when he talks about art is a, combination or a fusion between world and earth. And he brings up, Holderlin and the poetry of Holderlin and how Holderlin was kind of like a national poet, right? I mean, Holderlin, if the audience are not familiar with Holderlin, uh, Frederick, I think that's how you say his first name. Frederick Holderlin was a
Yeah,
obscure. Go ahead.
it's the same as Nietzsche. Heidegger points out a lot of like similarities between Holderlin and Nietzsche. He says that like Nietzsche is the poetic philosopher, while Holderlin is the philosophical poet. Uh,
Yeah, yeah, that does that's pretty apt. But also too, Nietzsche read Holderlin early on in his life. I think he was still a teenager. He was reading Holderlin. I know when he was in school because he went to like a Lutheran school, and they were
yeah,
saying like, okay,
theology
you're
actually.
pretty. Go
He
ahead.
really he was like, yeah, he went to a Lutheran. I think it was even a seminary. I'm not 100% sure, but he was like
Yeah, it
considered
was a
brilliant when it came to theology.
yeah, and I remember reading like they were like, okay, you're a pretty smart guy, but like you gotta quit it with this weird like Holderlin stuff, this weird poetry you're reading. So yeah, there's a tie to there, but the reason why I bring up that essay not only because of that, but just in general, I think Heidegger probably taking this from that tradition of Nietzsche, Holderlin, that art is very primal, very important in maintaining, particular cultural outlook, cultural slash metaphysical outlook.
Yes, and but one of the things that Heidegger even says is that it's not really possible to have art after metaphysics is done, and he does think that we're like at the end of metaphysics. He has a lot of things. He even sometimes refers to it as the end of philosophy because of how uh, indistinguishable metaphysics and philosophy are. Uh, and one of the things that he says is he wants to replace it with what he just calls thinking, which is kind of the more true sense of philosophy. Although I guess I could talk about that, but that's a bit of a maybe that's a bit of a tangent. I don't know.
No, go ahead, because that's interesting. Um, I think that's interesting because it's like, hold on. Let me say this real quick.
Yeah.
Let me finish this up. I would say I think it's interesting because it's like, his whole philosophical endeavor is like arguing against, thinking. Like, when you read Being in Time, he's saying like, we are captured by Gestalt, like this very scientific way of perceiving the world. And like, throughout the whole work, he's trying to like, or he's making an argument against that type of perception of the world. But like, you talk with the metaphysics, and all we have left is thinking. It seems like, those two perspectives are like paradoxical.
So I would say they are actually not opposites at all, because I think what you're referring to in the first one is he's not actually against thinking, he's against reason. And
Okay.
one of my favorite quotes from him is, it goes something like that thinking can only begin if we realize that reason, which has been glorified like for all of our history, is actually the adversary of thought. So this is actually one of, I think he says this in his essay on the end of metaphysics, but he says that thinking and reason are actually opposed to each other, because reason is not actually thinking. It's more of this like form of interrogation, like physical interrogation, where you take something like as a concept and you're trying to like force it to fit into a certain box, and all of these kinds of things that he thinks the vast majority of people who are called thinkers are actually doing. Is they're doing this kind of like game with numbers and symbols, and they're trying to like force the world to conform to some kind of predetermined matrix that they've set up. And he thinks that this is actually the worst adversary of thought, because even something like I don't know, physical activity or something that sometimes is put as opposed to thought, like there's thought and there's action or something, even that isn't as opposed to thought as reason is, because reason actually takes thought and distorts it. At least action it's just something different. It's not there to like lie about what the essence of thought is, while reason actually basically grasps all of thought from the inside. So it's actually the greater adversary.
So, would you say like Heidegger's thinking, or his concept of thinking, is more poetic than
well, he
like
does
conceptual?
so
Go ahead.
he does actually mention like thought as being poetic, and but he also, he's not, it doesn't seem like he quite lands on that. I think he tries to go, he says it's like beyond, it's beyond both reason and poetic. It's neither of those, although he does think poetry has a very important role, and he actually talks about the thinker and the poet as like two figures that like are separated by mountains but are united because of how high up they both are on each mountain. Like they are both standing on two different mountains, so they're separated because they're on two different mountains, but they're united because they're both on top of each of their mountains. So he does think it is something distinguishable from poetry. But one of the things he says about thinking is that it's simple. So it's incredibly simple, but it's also incredibly hard, but it's hard not because it requires to know lots of things or because it has some kind of complexity. It's hard more because it takes something like courage and like a like pure sense of attunement, where like you're entirely like you have the right composition to do thinking. Like it's, in a way you could even say it's like hard more in the sense that a physical task is hard than in the sense that like math equations are hard or something. Is his sense of thinking. But he does really note it's like pure simplicity, that it's like something very pure and simple. It doesn't require a lot of like chatting about different things and all of these different complex strings and maps and webs. That's not something that he thinks is there in what thought actually is.
So it's kind of like letting go, right? So you know,
Actually, that's perfect. Yeah, you just reminded me. There's this. Sorry, if you can keep saying what you're just going to say, and I'll add.
oh yeah, I was just gonna say, yeah, it's like letting go. Like you compare it to back to Gestalt or like, Cartesian thinking, this rationalism, like you were saying, rationalists, they tend to, or rational thinking, tends to try to, compartmentalize the world into certain figures, symbols, signs that are very easy to digest and, quantifiable. While letting go is like taking the world as it is, and like, reflecting on the world based upon like, your in intuitive or direct experience with the world. Like for example, let's say I'm walking, in the park, and I see a bird, standing by like the sidewalk, and me seeing the bird, in relation to the sidewalk in the park, I just have a thought. I just thought of something. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of like, um, inspiration. You know, uh, that's how I understand what you're saying. If I'm, misquoting, what you said, let me know. But that's how I understand it.
I think that's very accurate, especially with what you're saying with letting go, because there's this word that Heidegger uses a lot in his later works, which is Gelassenheit, which is,
Mm.
he borrows it from Master Eckhart. It's a word Master Eckhart, who is actually like the first German philosopher ever, uses in his works. And
So
Gelassenheit has
who? Hold up. I'm sorry. I was gonna ask a quick question. So just for the audience, who is Mr. Eckhart?
so Master Eckhart, and in German it's Meister Eckhart because that's like
Okay,
German word for
Meister.
master. But in English it's Master Eckhart. Some people still call him Meister. He was this Christian mystic who had a lot of various. He was controversial within the Catholic Church. I believe he was kicked out. I'm not sure. There was definitely some condemnations of him. He wrote about this idea he had called the Godhead, which basically is kind of the sense of the difference between the ground of something and the thing. So he thought that like there's the soul is like the ground of a human, and God himself also has a deeper essence, which is the Godhead. And that was kind of a big part of what his thinking was, including also the idea that through the Godhead, humans were actually much more closely connected to God on a much deeper level than in standard Christian theology. And this is why he was also a mystic, and he had various mystical writings and ideas about the various ways of approaching God, which are all controversial within like the standard scholastic Christian theology. Uh, so he had this term Gelassenheit, which translates various ways. The most common way it gets translated, I think, is releasement. It could also be translated as detachment, and then also letting be, which is very similar to letting go. And letting be is basically what you were saying. That's basically what Heidegger thinks thought is, uh, because in a sense, that's also what being is. Like I was talking about the difference between being and beings earlier, and I couldn't quite give the best definition. There's not really a perfect definition, but actually maybe a good way of saying is that there's beings, and beings are, they, you could say that they are that which bees. This is one of the things that it gets tricky with language to get these concepts out. So they might not sound grammatically correct. But then there's being, which is that which lets beings be. And it's that, it's not like Heidegger has a lot to say about what being isn't. So being isn't some principle. It's not the common essence of all beings. It's not any of these things. It's like that which he sometimes says it's that which gives. It gives the gift of being. So it lets beings be. And that's kind of what Gelassenheit is. But Gelassenheit is the human way of doing the same thing. And by doing the same thing that being does, you're actually get far, far closer to getting to the truth of being than you are if you try to do the opposite, where you use like this form of like technological mastery, which Heidegger thinks is completely paralleled within like rational thinking. He thinks that like using technology to obliterate the earth is equivalent to using like reason in your head to obliterate philosophy and things that are of a metaphysical nature, I guess.
So, one last thing before we go. I'm looking at the time. We're almost amount of time. I wanted to ask about Heidegger in connection with postmodern philosophy, specifically, Derrida and Deleuze. Can you elaborate on that? Like, can you,
So
what is the
I know
connection?
very little. I know very little about Derrida. I know that a lot of his idea of deconstruction comes from Heidegger's idea of destruction, which is Heidegger calls it, I think, the destruction of the history of metaphysics, and then later Derrida calls it deconstruction. So I think that comes from there. The main thing I know is that Deleuze is actually, in a way, opposed to Heidegger. I think
Okay.
he learns a lot from Heidegger, but one of his biggest disagreements with Heidegger is that Heidegger thinks that metaphysics is done and that now it's like this other thing. Deleuze is probably the biggest figure proposing a return to metaphysics, where he's trying to create like a postmodern metaphysics that aligns with like Bergson and like various different more postmodern scientific theories. And also he's trying to turn Nietzsche into more of a metaphysician, which actually Heidegger also did, but Heidegger did it as a more of a criticism of Nietzsche when Heidegger was explaining how Nietzsche is a metaphysician, while Deleuze is doing it as like affirmation of Nietzsche. So I think that it's not like someone like Hegel is really one of Deleuze's greatest philosophical adversaries, or someone like Plato, but Heidegger, I would say, is more of like a minor adversary for him, uh, just in the sense that I think he kind of sees Heidegger as being too conservative and too critical of Nietzsche, and not really understanding what Nietzsche was actually trying to do. That's my understanding of Deleuze's uh, position there.
That's interesting that Deleuze says that minor Heidegger doesn't understand Nietzsche, and Nietzsche's German. They're both German thinkers, and this French
Well,
guy.
I would
Go
so
ahead.
one thing I would note though is that Nietzsche himself has said before that he wishes he had written in French because he thinks
Yeah,
Germans
that
will
is true.
understand him. So there could be an argument to be made that actually a French guy is the right guy to understand Nietzsche.
Yeah, you know what? The more you think about that, I think that makes a lot of sense because, like, if you read Nietzsche, he references a lot of French thinkers. Rousseau being one of his most frequent people that he brings up. And I remember reading Will Power again before doing this podcast, and his section on nihilism, he talks about Rousseau, and he's like, he's like, what's the word for it? He's going against Rousseau. He's like disagreeing with him, and like in his disagreement with Rousseau, it's like very unfortunate for him. Like he doesn't want to, disagree with Rousseau, but he has to. Like he has to admit, that, okay, he's wrong about X, Y, and Z. So yeah, and also you have the French moralists, like one of my favorite French moralists from the 17th century is and my French is pretty bad, but well, I said I'm working on it. La Rochefoucauld. He was a French nobleman from the I want to say the Bourbon dynasty. I'm thinking Louis the 14th, one of the last, or really the longest reigning monarchs in European history, and probably one of the last great French uh, kings. I wouldn't say statesmen. I would say he's one of the best French statesmen that country ever had, but you got Napoleon, but like yeah, so he was alive during that time, and he writes this book called Maxims, and you read the book, it's kind of like an etiquette, like a moral etiquette list, or yeah, list of like catchphrases and quotes of how to be a good French nobleman in the late 19th centuries, but not 19th, 17th century. So yeah, I can see that string of French thinking permeating Nietzsche's thought, and why possibly a Deleuze would be more, in conjunction with Nietzsche versus Heidegger.
Yes. Although obviously also Heidegger would understand, and a lot of people understand that even if you are from the same culture or a different culture or whatever, it's not necessarily the most important thing when it comes to actually understanding that thinker properly. And I think Heidegger would acknowledge that Nietzsche himself would disagree with Heidegger's interpretation of Nietzsche, but that
Okay.
wouldn't matter too much for Heidegger because his point is he's saying he's looking at Nietzsche as a philosopher, not as a personality. Like there's one line from Heidegger where he says that when it comes to Aristotle, it's important that he was like his historical biography. He was born, he wrote, and he died. So he had like really important understanding. Like for him, it's extremely important to separate the personality from the philosopher because you kind of have to do that. Because what if like the personality is very contingent? Like you could have Plato when he was on his deathbed say, actually, all of my philosophy is about I don't know dancing clowns or something, and that wouldn't actually him saying that just because Plato says that doesn't actually change what Plato's philosophy is. It would still be the philosophy of the forms, and just some moment of Plato on his deathbed saying something as a personality doesn't actually change what Plato the philosopher is. So that's kind of how Heidegger approaches philosophers, and I guess it's actually how a lot of philosophers approach
Yeah,
other
they
philosophers.
do. They do. And that's why, like, going back or thinking of my own thinking, I never saw myself as like honest philosopher because, like, I'll talk to philosophy people, and they're always like talking about like these ideals abstracted from the person who created the ideal, and I always see, philosophy as an extension of the person. Nietzsche writes or philosophizes a certain way because he's this kind of guy. Heidegger philosophizes a certain way because he's this, kind of guy in contradiction to Nietzsche, so on and so forth. So the fact that like Heidegger says a lot of philosophers thinks that way is very interesting to me because like I said, I don't think that way. I think in order to
And
understand,
Nietzsche also doesn't think
go
that
ahead.
way. Nietzsche is another
Okay.
example of someone who doesn't think that way. Nietzsche does have a really strong belief that you can't separate the action from the person doing the action. You can't separate the personality from the philosophy. You can't separate the drives and the intents. Like you just can't separate these into like these like platonic solids.
So maybe I'm more Nietzsche influenced than Heidegger because, like I said, like that is just how I see the world. Like I remember when I was writing my final paper for graduate studies, I was telling my professor because I actually like failed the paper initially, and I was just telling her like, you know, I see the world a certain way. I can't unthink the way that I see the world, right? Uh, my psychological personality is a extension of my writing. So if you require a certain style that is radically different from how I write or perceive the world, it's going to be very hard for me to do that because that's just not how I perceive and understand the world, right? So yeah, I guess I'm on the Nietzsche camp. I don't know.
Well, I think this was good. I think we should also cover more of these topics. Maybe if someone comments which of those topics they'd like an elaboration on, we can do that because I feel like we covered a lot too much and a lot of it wasn't really explained well. So on my part, like I think I didn't go into enough detail on a lot of things. So yeah.
You're good. We're good. We're good. We're going to end it here. As always, like and subscribe, and you have a great day.